Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Coach University. This is the September Pay It Forward speaker series. Thank you so much for joining me. My name is Joon Kim. I'm an educational consultant, and I specialize in working with students and basically any learner that is interested in learning more about learning itself. And certainly all of you have the opportunity to pay it forward. Whatever you learn from here today, apply to your own life or use it to help someone else. So thank you for joining me. Let's go ahead and get started. So today we're talking about lifelong learning. This is a phrase that has become very popular. It's become almost a catchphrase. I'm a lifelong learner, or it could be a job posting that says looking for, it has maybe the qualifications, but maybe at the very end, it will say lifelong learner, right? And why is that? Why is this something? And first of all, before we get to the why, first, I always like to address what is it? What is lifelong learning? And as the word suggests, it really is a commitment to the continual learning process. And this seems pretty, obvious, very rhetorical, but this is something that does merit a lot of attention to because of the very fact that there is an ongoing knowledge explosion. And by knowledge explosion, what I mean is it really is like an explosion, something that expands rapidly. We know from the history of anything that mankind has recorded, the rate at which new knowledge is being discovered is incredible. It's what we would say exponential growth, that it is not the same rate of growth, but it's getting faster and faster and faster. Just think about just something as simple as YouTube. YouTube is a video that everybody is familiar with, everybody has used. I challenge any one of you to try to meet someone who either has never used YouTube, watched YouTube, or doesn't even know what YouTube is. It's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to find someone who fits that. So we're all familiar with YouTube. And so there's an incredible amount of information that is accessible through YouTube and other media outlets online as well. But I use YouTube because it is so ubiquitous. So many people use it. It is international. It is a global phenomenon that people are using it to find answers to questions. I think we've all used YouTube to solve a problem around the house, whether it is a clogged sink or maybe something wrong with our car. We use YouTube to try to figure out how to fix it. So we know the value of YouTube. We know that there's a lot of other information in there. And for those of us who were students, let's say in high school or college, pre-YouTube, the way we gain information was very different. We would have to speak to other people. We would go to this place called the library. And back then, libraries had these things made out of wood, very thin sheets called books. These days, it's very difficult to find a library that actually has books. I work in higher education. I work with a lot of college students, grad students. And when they talk about doing research, that looks very different than in the past. Because in the past, you would go to a library, you would have to locate where a certain book was physically located, take the elevator or escalator or stairs and track that book down. Fast forward to today, it looks very different, doesn't it? It's about just typing it into Google or some other search engine and trying to locate that article or piece of writing to read about that information. So access to information has really, really changed. And so that kind of ties into this concept of lifelong learning. So one of the first things that I believe all graduate schools and students will learn today, regardless of which country you're in, I think is the reality that you're only going to know this material fully at that moment in time. Said another way, it means that if you go to grad school in the year 2022 and you are studying a particular discipline, it means that you will know everything about that discipline up to that point, 2022. Because after you graduate, there could very well and most likely new information being discovered and added to what you thought you knew. So this is one of those things where we have to understand what is involved here. And linking it to what I've always done in my series is the connection to education. We have to think about why we send our children to school, as well as for those of us adult learners, why do we choose to go to school, right? Certainly we can say we're going to school, college, maybe graduate school, a certain vocational school, to earn a particular certificate or some type of an educational record that will enhance our candidacy for a job, let's say. And then for our children, why do they go to school? Okay. Now, some of us parents, and again, I myself being a father of three, as a parent, love sending the kids to school. Why? Because we feel comforted that our kids are going to learn the knowledge and skills that they need to be productive members of society. However, we have to recognize that the school system has changed through the years or decades, actually. When you look at sort of the origins of the school system, right? We're talking about the public school system. Now, when I say public, I know there's a temptation to differentiate between, let's say, tax-funded school system versus private tuition paid by individual families. But really, it doesn't matter, because in all the objective is very, very similar, meaning that the goal is to produce these young people to have certain abilities that they didn't have before they started school, okay? But let's get into that a little bit deeper. So what was the objective of the earliest system of education, where children from different households collectively came together to learn together? If we go further back, and again, this is regardless of the continent or the culture, the primary teacher, if you will, of each child was, who do you think? All right, you gave it some thought. Well, would you be surprised if I told you the first teacher would be the parents? Of course not. You would not be surprised, because as the parents, we are the primary caregiver, and we, of course, just naturally spend a considerable amount of time with our children. So as they get older, even from pre-verbal, pre-speech, we're teaching them as parents. However, they get to an age where, now this is where it varies. Some cultures, some countries will have pre-K and preschools and kindergartens and pre-Ks, and there's slight variations. But ultimately, they're all created to do the same thing, which is to start making learning process more formalized, more structured. And not to mention, as the society has changed. So when we think about the earliest of civilization, where families were mostly agricultural, we lived apart from each other. The land was widespread out. The households were far apart. And again, this holds true across continent. Now, obviously, in today's 2022, we still see that difference. There are some communities where it's very dense. When we think about places like New York City, London, Seoul, Tokyo, very, very dense, highly, highly urban, where you just are surrounded by people. And then, of course, there are families and communities that are more rural, agricultural, much more further spread out. This is where students would have to take bus to get to school instead of walking. So the history of early education is that these children from different households, after being taught by their parents. And as the parents' demands and responsibilities changed, so too did what families did for their children's education. So for example, very traditionally, again, cutting across all cultures and traditions, the father, the husband, was the primary income earner for the family, whereas the mother, traditionally, historically, stayed home to take care of the children, teach the children. However, you fast forward, and with the change of more women entering the workforce, that created a need for the children to be taught, quote, by professionals. Now, again, I'm not here to argue that that is a good thing or a bad thing. It's merely to share with you to help us reflect on these changes that have occurred throughout our history. And so as mothers left the home to enter the workforce, children stayed home or obviously went to school and then came home. So really, that's what sort of drove the need for children to be schooled together in a group setting, in a public school. And again, I use public school synonymously with whether it's a private school, a Montessori school, or any of these other many variations that we see today. But these are where students are amongst other children learning together. So in the early stages of this public school system, what was the objective? Was it to be a learner? Right. And then again, we touched upon it a little bit last week. What does it mean to learn something? Is it just to memorize something? Well, back then in the early Industrial Revolution, we needed more children who were going to be entering into the labor workforce to be able to follow instructions, to work in the warehouses, to work in the factories. They really needed to be able to quickly understand and execute those instructions. So it's different. It's different from trying to think of a problem thinking of a solution to a problem. It was merely to carry out, to execute certain tasks. And so here you have this evolution, these changes over the years, where students have been conditioned to follow instructions. I mean, think about our own education, everyone. Do you remember when you were in school where you have to write your name? And by the way, first name, last name, or do you put last name, first name? Obviously, those are little subtle differences, but nonetheless, those are very important instructions. You have to put your name on your paper. You have to put the date. And not only that, there was a specific format of the date you would have to put. And then, what period or which course was it? I mean, there were these very specific instructions. And that really is the foundation of our early childhood education, is to follow instructions. And as we also get more intellectually mature, we would be encountering more complex tasks, more beyond just rote memorization. Now, for those of you that are interested, Bloom's taxonomy of learning, okay, that's Bloom, B-L-O-O-M. Bloom created a taxonomy of various levels of learning, which I think is very helpful. In fact, I'll be covering it later this month. Bloom's taxonomy of learning. It's a great little nifty thing you can use. Again, not just for students, not just for, for parents, but really it's an excellent way to think about our entire sort of life in terms of learning. Every day we're learning. And so going back to this whole concept of lifelong learning, so our economies have shifted. We really have gone from a knowledge-based, what do you know, to what can you do, right? So instead of just knowing something, it's insufficient. You have to actually be able to execute. So that's why, going back to what I said earlier about YouTube videos, we can easily pull up YouTube videos and find someone who's fixing a problem, addressing a problem. But does that mean that we can then turn around and fix that problem ourselves? I think if we're honest, we would say no. I think we would watch that video once. We would say, okay, I got it. You would go and try to do it yourself. And some of us, we're very fortunate. We will fix the problem, and it's great. We feel very accomplished. We feel good about ourselves, and we'll have a great rest of the day. But let's be honest, there are often times where we are unable to fix that problem. It's still, we see the video and we think to ourselves, you know what, maybe that's just a bad video. I need to find another one. So you look for another video. Now that one does approach the problem maybe slightly different. So you feel like, okay, maybe this is the one. So you follow its instructions and then you try to perform those steps. No luck. You still have the problem. So again, it's not so much the lack of knowledge. And this is one of the most critical things that we need to understand about being a lifelong learner. It is not simply knowing more stuff. Let me repeat that. Being a lifelong learner doesn't mean you know more things. Because again, as we began today's session, it's impossible for you to know everything. Well, we all know that, right? We know we don't know everything. But it has to do with the fact that information, knowledge is constantly expanding. There are things that are happening that, we thought was, true. So for example, one thing that might come to our mind is Pluto, right? Not the Disney character Pluto, but Pluto as in the planet, or what once we thought was a planet went to no, it's no longer a planet, it's a big star, and back and forth. So knowledge changes. That's another thing too. As technology, science, and advancement changes, our knowledge changes, and we need to edit that. We need to update. And so this is one of those things about lifelong learning, is that you accept that you don't know everything. And even when you're an expert, okay, even when you are considered an expert, true experts know that their expertise is still limited, and that they just know most of the things that we have available to us now. A lot of experts, you'll hear them really stay within the lines. They will not venture out to even, make a definitive statement about something that we would all, as the general public, would assume they would know. So for example, where do we see this? Healthcare, in medicine. So you go see an optometrist or an ophthalmologist, and then you ask about your rash on your skin. I mean, they're a doctor, right? They went to medical school. But the first thing they'll tell you is, well, I'm in ophthalmology, I'm an eye doctor. Skin is not my area of expertise. And even then, you can go see an ophthalmologist, and they might say, well, I specialize in working on the cornea, not the retina. So, I mean, you have such a highly ultra hyper specialized kind of knowledge base these days, which there are pros and cons to that as well, right? In healthcare, one could argue that the specialty is a good thing, but again, it could easily be critiqued that it is not so good to only specialize in just one little thing. That, again, we need to understand, especially in healthcare, that you're not treating eyeballs, for example. You may be an ophthalmologist. You may be a retinal specialist ophthalmologist, but those eyeballs are not walking into your office by themselves. They're attached to an entire human being. So really, to understand the whole person. So even a little bit of psychiatry, understanding a person, right? So all of this to say that, the way that our lifelong learning approach needs to be, it really, number one, I would say, if you're taking notes, the most important attribute of being a lifelong learner is the commitment. Is to make a commitment to say that, I will be a lifelong learner. And that means you're basically just making a promise that you'll be putting forth effort to try to seek and learn and develop and add to your knowledge base. How often have some of us said, that's not important. I'm not going to ever use that, right? So imagine if you're a parent and your child heard you say a comment like that. Well, I really don't need to learn that. I'm not going to use it anyways, right? Is that truly what you want to share with your child? That you approach learning purely for its utility value, that if it's not useful, then you don't want to learn it? I mean, this is one of the reasons why in our higher education system around the world, I'm going to venture out and say you have a lot of classic disciplines, whether it be literature, the humanities, anything like that. It's become less and less popular. It's really a lot of educational institutions have been cutting back on the funding, or in some cases, just outright elimination of those departments. Because why? Well, why would you want to learn those types of subject matter when you can't get a job afterwards? And so we have seen this, right? Everywhere you go, it's about STEM, right? Those of you that are not familiar, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Those are the disciplines that are worth studying. And I hope you'll agree that while those are certainly important and there's a need for them, that truly learning is the appreciation of pretty much anything and everything in our universe. And so for my family, for example, my wife and I, we are not musically inclined whatsoever, but we very much support our three children to learn and appreciate music. A couple of them are taking music lessons. So again, lifelong learning is a commitment to recognize that there's such a joy, the joy in the process of learning. And the other thing that we will also cover, motivation, but I mean, it's really difficult to have a conversation about learning without referencing motivation. Because what is our motivation for learning? What is our motivation to be a lifelong learner? Well, that's going to vary. And we'll dive deeper into motivation at a later talk. But for now, just recognizing that being a lifelong learner is making that commitment to say, I'm going to be curious about things. I want to seek out knowledge because purely for the sake of learning. Because learning is great. I mean, again, we don't know if we're ever going to use it. Maybe we'll never use it. And that's okay. And I think this is when we appreciate something for the intrinsic value that it brings pleasure to us. So going back to music, some of us would say, I don't find any joy in music. Okay. Well, there's a great deal of power and influence in music. Maybe we're not aware of it. In fact, we know how powerful music is. For those of you that are in music, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. You already know how important music is and how intrinsically involved it is in so many areas of our lives. I watched a documentary fairly recently about music composers and the people who make music for movies. When we watch a movie, you got to have great script, you got to have great acting, you got to have a great storyline. But one of the things that's so frequently overlooked is the music. That background music, very, very subtle, very quiet, but it has a powerful influence on how we experience a certain scene or emotion. So lifelong learning is very similar to that. We may not truly get tangible, immediate return on our investments, let's say taking a course, for example, but lifelong learning has amazing joy in learning. And again, think about it this way, parents. Don't you want to bond with your kids, right? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. What parent doesn't want to build a strong, close relationship with their children? Well, guess what? One of the most powerful ways to forge that relationship is to learn something together. Now, some of you might say, well, that's very practical, right? So sure, I'm not saying don't do it because it's practical. But again, I think that's the beauty of learning, is that oftentimes you don't know what you're going to gain from that learning. But through that process, there's going to be all kinds of unexpected, amazing surprises. And one of them is this, learning something new with someone else. In this case, if you're a parent, with your child. Or maybe if you are in the early stages of dating, and instead of going to the usual, maybe dinner and a movie, you can go learn how to ice skate together, or you can go out. Now, I did not intend the series to be dating advice, but certainly if that's how you wish to apply what we are covering today, then please do so. But it's very powerful. Being a lifelong learner, commit yourself to learning, it will do wonders, including building and strengthening relationship with others. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope to see you tomorrow. Have a great day.